Number 10. The Tây Sơn Typhoon Pirates of the Gulf of Tonkin. Picture the Gulf of Tonkin in the late 1790s. The water is warm, jade green, and threaded with limestone islands that rise out of the sea like broken teeth. Somewhere between Hainan and the northern coast of what is now Vietnam, a Qing war junk is trying to hunt a fleet of Chinese pirates. The pirates have crossed an invisible line. They are not in Chinese waters anymore. They are in Vietnamese waters, licensed and paid for by the rebel emperor of the Tây Sơn dynasty, which means the Qing captain has two options: turn back or violate the sovereignty of a tributary state and start a diplomatic incident that will end his career. He turns back. That single hesitation, repeated 1,000 times over 3 decades, is how the greatest pirate confederation in world history was born. The Tây Sơn Rebellion began in 1771 when 3 brothers from a village called Tây Sơn in central Vietnam rose up against the Nguyen lords in the south and the Trinh lords in the north. It was one of the bloodiest civil wars Asia had seen in centuries. Hundreds of thousands died in wars and famines, and even more became homeless refugees. The rebellion swallowed the 300-year-old Black dynasty, humiliated Qing invasions, and turned the entire coastline of Vietnam into a war zone where the normal rules did not apply. The Tây Sơn needed a navy. They did not have one, so they made one out of pirates. They handed out marquee titles, brigadier general commissions, official seals, and blank recruitment papers to Chinese sea bandits from Guangdong and Fujian, and told them to bring in whoever they could find. In October 1780, a fisherman named Chen Tin Bu was blown off course by a sudden tempest and washed up on the coast of northern Annam. Within 8 years, he was walking around with papers, making him a Marquis of the Tây Sơn, authorized to recruit an entire Chinese pirate navy for the rebel emperor. He was not alone. Dozens of freebooter chiefs came south. They found something the Qing had never given them: safe harbors, legal cover, foundries willing to cast cannons, and workshops willing to repair hulls. Best of all, they found the weapon that would define the entire operation: the typhoon season. Every summer, the Gulf of Tonkin turns into a killing ground. Storms roll in from the South China Sea, funnel through the narrow gap between Hainan and the mainland, and detonate on the Vietnamese coast with winds that can rip a war junk to matchwood in an afternoon. The Qing Navy hated the typhoon months. Their captains delayed sailings, hugged the shore, and dared not commit their heavy sea junks to the open Gulf. The Tây Sơn pirates learned to love those months. Under the cover of storms, they raided the coasts of Guangdong and Fujian, hit merchant junks running the coastal trade, and vanished back into Vietnamese waters before the weather cleared. By 1790, the small border town of Gian Binh on the Sino-Vietnamese frontier had an economy more dependent on illegal piracy than on legitimate fishing. It was a pirate town under the protection of a foreign emperor and under the physical protection of the wind itself. And then, when the season shifted, they trained. This is where the Tây Sơn pirates matter for everything that comes after. When the Tây Sơn dynasty finally collapsed in 1802, under the hammer of the new Nguyen emperor, the surviving Chinese pirate captains sailed home to Guangdong, carrying decades of experience. They had learned how to organize fleets of hundreds of ships. They had learned how to run a floating economy on plunder and salt. They had learned how to use one country's coast to escape another country's navy. When they got home, they poured that knowledge into a new confederation that would soon be commanded by a woman named Zheng Yi Sao. And that is where our story ends, because her story deserves its own video. The Tây Sơn Typhoon pirates were the school, she was the graduate, and that is why they take number 10. Number 9, the Killigrews family of Cornwall. Falmouth today is a quiet Cornish port. Painted houses climb the hills, sailboats sleep in the 3rd largest natural harbor in the world, and tourists queue for cream teas along the waterfront. In the second half of the 16th century, if you sailed a Spanish or German merchant into that same harbor with a hold full of anything worth money, you had roughly a 50-50 chance of dying at your anchor. The reason had a name, and the name was Killigrew. The Killigrews were not stateless outlaws. They were not tattooed men in stripes shouting from the rigging of some clipper. They were English aristocrats. They sat in Parliament. They held offices from the crown. They were appointed governors of Pendennis Castle the coastal fortress built for Henry VIII in the 1540s to defend Cornwall from Spanish invasion. The head of the family, Sir John Killigrew of Arwenack, was the first hereditary captain of that castle. That meant he officially controlled all shipping through the mouth of the River Fal. He used that power exactly the way you would expect a Cornish aristocrat with a sea view and no morals to use it. He preyed on the cargoes of every ship that came within his reach. The Cornish coast is what old sailors call a lee shore. That means when the wind blows from the wrong quarter, and in Cornwall it usually does, a sailing ship cannot claw its way off the rocks. Ships that missed Falmouth in a gale piled up on the granite between the Lizard and the Manacles. The Killigrews did not have to attack most of the vessels they looted. The coast did it for them. They just waited on the cliffs with lanterns, wreckers' hooks, and small boats. What the sea gave them, they took. What they wanted, and the sea did not give them, they took anyway. The most notorious of them was a woman. Her name was Elizabeth Truinard, called Lady Killigrew, though contemporaries and later legend often muddled her with her daughter-in-law Mary Wolverston. So the two women sometimes blur into a single figure that the Cornish still call Old Lady Killigrew. Around 1582, a Spanish merchant ship called the Marie of San Sebastian dropped anchor in Falmouth Harbor to wait out foul weather. The captain went ashore, probably to Penryn, to arrange for provisions. When he was gone, Lady Killigrew allegedly sent her servants aboard the ship, killed a factor who resisted, seized the cargo, and had it stored at Arwenack House. The ship itself, in one version of the story, was quietly sailed off to Ireland and sold. She was arrested, she was tried, she was sentenced to death, and then Queen Elizabeth I pardoned her. That single decision tells you everything about the world the Killigrews lived in. England was in an undeclared shadow war with Spain, and Elizabeth had a national policy of using well-born pirates as a private navy she could deny in public and reward in private. Many Killigrews carried letters of marque official documents making it legal to plunder enemy shipping in the Queen's name. So when Lady Killigrew stepped over the line and looted a Spanish ship in a home harbor, the Queen quietly quashed the sentence. Her servants were less lucky. Several were hanged. She lived out her days as, at worst, a fence for stolen goods. Her son, Sir Henry Killigrew, was later made a vice admiral. The family kept the racket going for generations. They loaded lanterns onto cliffs to lure captains onto reefs. They ran fenced cargo up the rivers to Truro and Penryn. They intermarried with other West Country pirate dynasties until half the coast of Cornwall was one enormous smuggling and wrecking cartel. And they did it all on a lee shore infamous for eating ships in the shadow of the very castle they had been paid to garrison. No navy chased the Killigrews out of Falmouth. Not the Spanish, who had every reason to want them dead, not even the English crown, which found them too useful to hang. The waters they lived in were their moat. The lee shore that killed foreign captains protected them. And that is a very English kind of piracy, respectable, hereditary, and untouchable. Number 8. The Maniots of the Mani Peninsula. Now we leave the cold Atlantic and sail south, past Gibraltar, past Crete, into the deep blue of the Aegean until we reach a finger of rock jutting into the Mediterranean, like a threat. This is the Mani Peninsula, the middle of the three southern tongues of the Peloponnese, terminating at Cape Matapan, which is the southernmost point of continental Greece, and the second southernmost point in mainland Europe. The ancients believed the cave at the tip of Cape Matapan was one of the mouths of Hades, the entrance to the underworld itself. Sailors have believed something similar about the sea around it for 3,000 years. The Cape sits at the meeting point of the Ionian and Aegean, where winds funnel between the mountains of the Taygetus Range and blast across a coast with almost no natural harbors. Ships that miss the anchorage die on the rocks. Ships that make the anchorage often wish they had not. Because the people who lived on this rock, the Maniots, were pirates. Not part-time, not opportunistic, culturally, generationally, ferociously. The Maniots claimed descent from the ancient Spartans, and whether or not that claim survived scrutiny, their behavior did. Their villages were not villages so much as clusters of stone towers built for clan warfare, with narrow slits for windows and roofs, high enough that neighbors could snipe at each other across the alleyways, during blood feuds that sometimes lasted 100 years. The local Eastern Orthodox priests blessed pirate ships before they left the shore. Sometimes the priests came along on the raids. Most of the pirates came from Mesa Mani, Inner Mani, And one of the meanest nicknames for the region was Kakavulia, from the word kakavi, which was a cooking pan they wore as a helmet when they attacked passing ships from the rocks. Because that is what makes Maniot piracy strange. They were not always the ones going to the sea. Sometimes they let the sea come to them. They lit false signal fires at night to lure captains onto the reefs of Cape Matapan, and when the ships broke up on the rocks, the Maniots swarmed down the cliffs and killed anyone who reached shore alive. Then they picked over the wreckage. The Ottoman Empire ruled Greece for roughly 400 years. It ruled Mani, on paper, for centuries. In practice, it never truly landed on it. 3 times the Ottomans tried to conquer Mani outright. 3 times they were driven back into the sea. In 1803, the Capadon Pasha sailed a fleet to break the power of the Grigorakis clan. It failed. In 1807, they tried again. They failed again. In 1815, they landed at Scutari, the hometown of the Grigorakis, hoping to smash the pirate harbor there and burn out one of the 2 most notorious pirate havens in Mani, the Maniots, under Theodoros Grigorakis, drove them straight back into the water with more than 100 Ottoman dead. The most famous pirate the Mani ever produced was Libarakis Garikaris, born around 1644 in Oitilo, the other great Maniot pirate town. He served as a galley rower in the Venetian Navy as a boy. He grew up into a terror of the Aegean. He was captured by the Ottomans in 1667 and thrown into the banyo of Istanbul, chained in a slave prison awaiting execution. Instead, the Ottomans dragged him back out of the dungeon, made him Bey of Mani, and pointed him at their Venetian enemies. When it suited him, he served the Sultan. When it did not, he raided the Sultan's shipping. He died in exile in Brescia in 1710, a Maniot to the end, a man who had been a pirate, a slave, a bey, a fugitive, and a legend inside a single lifetime. The Ottoman Navy ruled the Mediterranean for the better part of 300 years. It could reach Algiers. It could reach Tunis. It could not, in any meaningful sense, reach the Mani. The pirates' fortress was the cape itself, the wind, the rocks, and the stone towers on the hills. And that is why the Maniots take number 8. Number 7. Sebastião Gonçalves Tibau, Pirate King of Sandwip. Sail east now, all the way east, past the Cape of Good Hope, past the Malabar coast, and up into the head of the Bay of Bengal, where the mightiest river system on the subcontinent. The Ganges and the Brahmaputra together dumps 100 million tons of silt a year into the sea. The result is the Sundarbans, the largest mangrove forest in the world, a horizontal maze of thousands of tidal channels, shifting mudbanks, and jungle islands. Bengal tigers still hunt men in there today. In the early 17th century, it was also the home port of a Portuguese salt trader who turned himself into a pirate king. His name was Sebastião Gonçalves Tibau. He was born around 1587 in a small town called Santo Antão do Tojal, just outside Lisbon. He arrived in the Bay of Bengal like thousands of other Portuguese adventurers drifting east on the tide of empire, looking for a way to get rich. He settled on Sandwip, a large silty island in the mouth of the Meghna estuary. Sandwip in 1600 was a border zone. The Mughals were pushing south from Bengal. The Kingdom of Arakan was pushing north up the coast. The Portuguese, split between the official viceroy in Goa and a swarm of unofficial freebooters who ignored Goa completely, were scattered across the region in small settlements like Chittagong and Dianga. Tibau was one of those freebooters. He had no charter, no salary, and no interest in obeying Goa's orders. In 1607, the King of Arakan turned on the Portuguese settlement at Dianga and massacred roughly 600 of them, including the son of Felipe de Brito, the Portuguese lord of Cirium in Burma. Tibau had just sailed in from the Meghna with a cargo of salt. He escaped the slaughter, gathered the survivors, and headed for open water. On Sandwip, a Muslim commander named Fatih Khan tried to take advantage of the chaos and seize the island. He killed the Portuguese who were living there. Tibau went straight back. In 1609, allied with the local Hindu king of Bakla, Tibau attacked Fatih Khan with 10 ships and 80 Portuguese men against Fatih Khan's 40 ships and 800. He fought through the night. By morning, Fatih Khan was dead, his fleet was smashed, and Tibau owned Sandwip. He crowned himself, in effect, king. For the next 8 years, he ruled the island as an independent sovereign, minting no coin but sending no tribute either. He built a fleet of light Bengali rivercraft called Jalias, perfect for the shallow tidal channels of the Sundarbans, and he used them to prey on Mughal shipping. Arakanese shipping and any European ship foolish enough to pass through his waters without paying tribute. His pirate lieutenants raided the Bengali coast for slaves, timber, and rice. He controlled Dakhan Shahbazpur, he controlled Patel Banga, he built a chain of small forts and safe anchorages across the delta. And when the Mughal Empire, the mightiest land power in Asia, tried to march its armies into the Sundarbans to root him out, the delta ate them. Mughal expeditions to the delta, bogged down in mud, lost their war elephants to the channels, watched their soldiers die of tropical disease, and pulled back with almost nothing to show. The Mughal navy was designed for river warfare on the Ganges, not for the horizontal tidal maze of Sandwip. And the Portuguese viceroy in Goa hated Tabau for ignoring his authority. He was alone. He liked it that way. His empire finally fell in 1616 and 1617, when the king of Arakan, Min Kamaung, launched a massive amphibious campaign against Sandwip and defeated him. Tabau vanishes from the historical record after that year. He was probably killed. His pirates, however, did not vanish. They allied themselves openly with Arakan, settled at Chittagong, and became the notorious Ferengi pirates whose slave raids into Bengal continued so ferociously that even today in Bengal the word Harmad, from the Portuguese Armada, still means pirate. It took a Mughal general named Shaista Khan to break them at last in 1666, more than half a century after Tabau first crowned himself on his Silt Island. The delta protected them all that time. That is what number 7 looks like when your fortress is made of mud. Number 6, the Ushkuiniki of Novgorod. Now we go north again, into the cold, into a world of gray rivers and pine forests, and into a chapter of pirate history that almost no one outside Russia has ever heard. The Ushkuiniki were medieval river pirates from the Republic of Novgorod, active from roughly the 12th century into the 15th. Their name comes from their boats. Ushku, shallow-drafted, clinker-built, longboats low, in the water, fast under oars, capable of carrying about 30 armed men and light enough that a crew could physically pick one up and portage it overland from one river system to another. That last detail is the thing that made them terrifying. Because the Ushkuiniki did not raid a coast, they raided a continent. From the great trade city of Novgorod, sitting on Lake Ilmen, they could paddle down the Volkhov into Lake Ladoga, and from there out into the Baltic through the Gulf of Finland. Or they could portage south and drop into the headwaters of the Volga, the great river of Russia, and follow it 3,700 kilometers all the way to the Caspian Sea. Or they could push east through the Kama and into the Ural Mountains and beyond into western Siberia. Anywhere there was water, a portage, or a rumor of fur wealth, an Ushkuiniki flotilla could get there. In 1187, if the chronicles are to be believed, they sailed all the way to Sweden and burned the royal city of Sigtuna to the ground, carrying home as loot a set of monumental bronze gates that were installed on the Cathedral of St. Sophia in Novgorod. Those gates are still there. In 1318, they ransacked the Finnish city of Turku, then called Aboa, and reportedly seized 5 years' worth of papal income tax destined for Rome. But their true masterpiece was not against Europe. It was against the Mongols. In the 14th century, the eastern half of what is now European Russia lay under the boot of the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate that had turned Kiev into rubble and forced the Russian princes into vassalage. The horse armies of the Mongols were the terror of the known world. They could not be caught, they could not be outfought on the open steppe, and they did not lose, unless you took to the rivers. In 1360, an Ushkuiniki fleet under the Boyar Anfal Nikotin dropped down the Volga and stormed the wealthy Golden Horde city of Zhukatau, known in the Russian sources as Zhukata, seizing its treasury. They then rode to Kostroma and threw a legendary feast on the loot. In 1365 and 1366, according to the Novgorod Chronicle, 3 large Ushkuiniki flotillas under leaders named Isif Valfromyevich, Vasily Fedorovich, and Alexander Obakinovich raided the Volga together and cleaned out both Tatar cities and Russian merchant vessels along the way. Their greatest campaign came in 1374, when 90 boats of Ushkuiniki descended the river and sacked Sarai Batu, the capital of the Golden Horde itself, the richest city in the entire Mongol dominion of Russia. Sacking Sarai was something no Russian prince had dared. It was a Novgorod prince named Dmitry Donskoy, who watched what the pirates had done to the invincible horde and 6 years later, in 1380, met and defeated the Mongols in open battle at Kulikovo. It is not too much to say that a river pirate raid was one of the sparks that eventually lit Russia's freedom from the Mongol yoke. The Mongols owned the steppe. Their cavalry had no answer to the Ushkuiniki. They could not chase a fleet up a river. They could not patrol a portage. They could not enter the reed marshes of the northern forests without dying. So the pirates kept coming, generation after generation, until finally, in 1409, an enormous Ushkuiniki fleet of 250 boats under Anfal Nikitin was tricked and defeated by a Tatar general on the lower Volga. By 1489, Ivan III of Moscow permanently disbanded them, but by that point they had already done their damage. The last river pirates of medieval Russia had beaten the Mongol Empire in its own backyard. And they had done it because the rivers were their fortress, and because a cavalry army has never yet been built that can float. That is number 6. Number 5, the Cossack Chaykas of the Black Sea stay in the same part of the world, but drop south to the Ukrainian steppe and drop the calendar forward to the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Below the rapids of the Dnieper, in the wild reed-choked marshes of the lower river, there is a community of free warriors who call themselves Cossacks, and who have made a strange kind of maritime tradition out of a very simple boat. The Chaika, meaning seagull in Ukrainian, is a low open-oar sail vessel about 18 meters long, capable of carrying somewhere between 40 and 70 men, and armed with a handful of small swivel guns. They are shallow draft. They can be dragged over sandbars, and their reed and hide fenders give them enough buoyancy that even in rough seas, they are extremely hard to sink. In fact, the French engineer Guillaume de Beauplan, who lived among the Cossacks in the 1630s, wrote that they could operate in shallow water and rough seas alike. The Chaika does not look like a warship. It looks like a large fishing dinghy. And on that boat, the Zaporozhian Cossacks routinely crossed the entire Black Sea and burned pieces of Istanbul. Read that again. On boats that would embarrass a modern lifeguard. They crossed 800 kilometers of open water, evaded the Ottoman Navy, which was the finest galley fleet in the Mediterranean world, and attacked the capital of the largest Muslim empire on earth. In 1594, a Cossack flotilla, estimated at 150 Chaikas, appeared off the Bosporus and struck the maritime installations around the Ottoman capital. In May 1615, an ataman named Petro Konashevich Sagaidachny led a fleet of 80 Chaikas, each carrying roughly 50 men, across the Black Sea and landed on the coast near Istanbul in mid-June. They burned the suburb of Scutari, the port district. On the Asian side, then hit Mizevna and Archuka, filled their boats with loot, and turned for home. Sultan Ahmed I watched the smoke from the windows of his own palace and, humiliated, sent Turkish galleys after them. The Ottomans caught the Cossacks at the mouth of the Danube. The Cossacks fought them, captured several galleys, and hauled the wounded Turkish admiral back to Ukraine as a trophy. When the Ottomans came looking for revenge the next year, under Admiral Ali Pasha, Sagaidachny met the Turkish squadron at the mouth of the Dnieper and destroyed it, seizing a dozen galleys and nearly 100 boats. Then he took the fleet on a victory tour of the Black Sea, blockaded Crimea, and stormed Kaffa, one of the largest Ottoman ports and the greatest slave market of the Black Sea, freeing thousands of Christian captives. In July 1624, the Cossacks came again. 70 to 80 Chaikas appeared on both sides of the Bosporus. On the night of the 9th, they attacked Istanbul again, burning residential and administrative buildings for 6 straight hours, destroying rows of magnificent villas along the European shore, and then retreating to sea in the morning. When the Sultan sent out a hastily improvised fleet under Damat Halil Pasha, the Cossacks arranged their Chaikas in a semicircle in the middle of the strait and dared him to attack. He blinked. They rode home in triumph. The French historian Michel Baudier wrote that the only mention of the Cossacks brings dread and terror to Constantinople. The Ottoman fleet ruled the sea. It did not matter. because the Cossacks did not need to defeat that fleet. They just needed to avoid it. Once a Chaika slipped past the Turkish galleys guarding the Dnieper's mouth, it disappeared into a reed marsh where the deeper draft Ottoman ships ran aground. The Sultan built new castles at the estuary. Grand Vizier Kuprulu Mehmed Pasha in the 1660s ordered fortresses raised at the Don and the Dnieper, self-standing watchtowers, and stone walls to try to bottle the pirates up. Tax records from the Ottoman port of Trabzon show revenue collapsing by 40% between the raids in 1631. Because of destruction and depopulation, the Ottomans could not stop them. The sea belonged on paper to the Sultan. The reeds belonged, in reality, to the Cossacks. And that is number 5. Number 4, the Qawasim of the Pirate Coast. Down through the Bosporus, past the Ottoman shore, out through the Suez route in the age before Suez existed, around Arabia, and up into the shallow, reef-strewn, roasting waters of the Persian Gulf, between the Great Red Desert of the Empty Quarter and the mountainous coast of Persia. There is a stretch of shoreline that in the early 19th century the British insisted on calling the Pirate Coast. Today, we call it the United Arab Emirates. And 200 years ago, it was home to a maritime confederation that a lot of modern Gulf historians will tell you were not really pirates at all, but a legitimate Arab naval power that the British Empire needed a convenient excuse to smash. Their name is the Qawasim, and they are one of the most controversial entries on this list. Let us take the case at its highest. The Qawasim were a confederation of Sunni tribes based around Ras Al Khaimah and Sharjah, with strongholds and vassals on both the Arabian and Persian sides of the Strait of Hormuz, including Kesham Island, Bandar Abbas, and Lenge. By the early 1800s, they had built the largest indigenous navy in the Gulf, hundreds of shallow draft dhows crewed by thousands of hardened sailors, and they were pushing back against two things the British Empire could not tolerate. First, they were expanding their trade at the expense of the Sultan of Muscat, who was Britain's oldest Gulf ally. Second, they were bringing Arabian Peninsula trade under Arab, rather than European, control. When Qawasim dhows began seizing British and East India Company ships, the British answer was piracy. When modern historians look at the same events, especially those from the region, they often see naval war. The label pirate was, at least in part, imperial spin. That controversy is not just a footnote, it is the whole story. But whatever we call them, the Gulf they lived in was a nightmare for European warships. The Qawasim coast is shallow. It is dotted with coral reefs and sandbanks that shift with every monsoon. It was unmapped by European hydrographers. The dhow, by contrast, is a shallow draft vessel, sharp-bowed with a shallow keel and a huge lateen sail that could work into the tightest wind and slip across a reef that would rip the copper sheathing off a British frigate. The Qawasim knew every channel. The British did not. So the British did what the British always did. They mounted amphibious invasions. In September 1809, a combined East India Company and Royal Navy expedition sailed from Bombay with 2 Royal Navy frigates, 8 company cruisers, a bomb ketch, and 1,300 soldiers. They shelled and stormed Ras Al Khaimah on the 13th of November, burned the town to the ground, and torched roughly 50 Qawasim vessels. It was a devastating raid. It solved nothing. Within a few years, the Qawasim were back at sea. They captured British and Indian merchantmen up and down the Gulf, and in one famous incident, the East India Company cruiser Sylph, a dhow fleet estimated at around 40 vessels, then entered the Indian Ocean itself, and within a short time captured 20 merchant ships and effectively closed Western Indian commerce. The British had to try again. In November 1819, Major General Sir William Grant Keir sailed from Bombay with 1,450 European soldiers, 2,100 sepoys, the 50-gun frigate HMS Liverpool, HMS Curlew, HMS Eden, a company cruiser, and 7 more East India Company warships waiting in the Gulf. They anchored off Ras Al Khaimah on the 4th of December 1819, landed southwest of the town, entrenched to within 300 yards of the walls, and pounded the fortifications for days. Ras Al Khaimah was taken, Daya, the nearby fortress, was taken, 10 Qawasim vessels were burned, reported Arab dead ran to 400 or more. In January 1820, the surviving Qawasim sheikhs were compelled to sign the General Maritime Treaty. The coast the British had called the Pirate Coast was renamed the Trucial Coast, and Britain's dominance of the Gulf, which would last until 1971, began there. It took 2 full-scale amphibious invasions to reach these men. Not raids, not blockades, full military expeditions on the scale of Napoleonic warfare, because sailing into their waters simply did not work. Whether or not the Qawasim were pirates, the sea that protected them absolutely was, and that is why they take number 4. Number 3, Abraham Blauvelt of the Mosquito Coast. Swing back across the Atlantic, past the West Indies, and up against the eastern spine of Central America, where a strip of jungle and mangrove between the mountains and the Caribbean ends the wildest coastline in the New World. This is the Mosquito Coast, named for the mosquito people who lived there, though every European sailor who ever tried to navigate it agreed that the more obvious insects also earned the name. It runs roughly from Cape Gracias a Dios on the modern border of Nicaragua and Honduras down to the mouth of the San Juan River. It is a place of shoal lagoons, uncharted reefs, sheer surf-beaten headlands, and rivers that meander through mangrove into waters so shallow that a merchantman drawing 3 meters is aground before she knows it. The Spanish, who claimed the coast on paper, almost never went there. They preferred Portobello, Cartagena, and Havana, that left the coast wide open for anyone with a shallow draft ship and the nerve to feel their way in. In the 1630s, a Dutch privateer felt his way in and never really left. His name was Abraham Blauvelt, sometimes Albertus Blauvelt, in the older Dutch records one of the last of the great Dutch corsairs of the mid-17th century, and he did something no imperial cartographer had bothered to do. He charted it. Blauvelt worked for the Dutch West India Company. He was recorded exploring the coasts of what are now Honduras and Nicaragua on West India Company business by no later than 1633, mapping the Mosquito Keys and the mainland at Cape Gracias a Dios. He was among the first small group of colonists who tried to settle the Mosquito Keys and the Cape Gracias region using the English colony of Providence Island in the Caribbean as a rear base. When Providence fell to a Spanish attack in 1641, Blauvelt did not run home to the Netherlands. He went deeper into the coast. He knew. Around 1640, he began operating as a privateer, and in 1644, he was commanding his own ship raiding Spanish shipping from a base in southwest Jamaica at a bay that today is still called Blue Fields, Jamaica in his honor. He sold his prizes and cargoes back in Dutch New Amsterdam, the tiny colony that would one day become New York. When peace between Spain and the Netherlands broke out with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, Blauvelt could not stay in New Amsterdam without inviting Spanish diplomatic complaints. So he shifted operations briefly to Rhode Island until the colonists there, terrified of being branded as a pirate haven, ran him off. He then took command of a French ship called Le Gars and spent years of his life living among the Mosquito people at Cape Gracias a Dios. He knew their language, he knew their tides, he knew where the deep water lay hidden between mudflats that changed shape every rainy season, and he taught his fellow buccaneers how to use it. The main Blauvelt refuge became a wide sheltered lagoon on the coast of what is now southeastern Nicaragua, at the mouth of a wide, sluggish river called the Escondido, which, appropriately enough, means the hidden river. The lagoon was almost invisible from the sea and impassable to any deep-drafted Spanish galleon. Under Blauvelt and the pirates who followed him, it became a rendezvous for English and Dutch buccaneers for the rest of the 17th century. And in 1678, the same lagoon became the capital of the British Protectorate over the Mosquito Coast. Today, the city of Bluefields, Nicaragua, sits there, one of the most important Caribbean ports of that country, its very name, a Spanish attempt at the surname Blauvelt. He was recruited one last time in 1663 for Christopher Mings's raid on Campeche Bay in Spanish Mexico. And after that, the record goes dark. He simply vanishes into the coast he had spent 3 decades charting. The Spanish never followed him in. They could not. Their pilots did not know the mud. Their ships drew too much water. Their crews did not survive the fevers. Abraham Blauvelt built no empire, took no title, and killed no kings. He just knew a coastline better than the empire that claimed to own it. And that is why 380 years later, a city on that coast still carries his name. Number 3. Number 2. Cai Qian of the Fujian coast. Now we come back to China. Between the mainland province of Fujian and the island of Taiwan, there is a stretch of water only about 130 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, called the Taiwan Strait. It looks small on a map. It is one of the deadliest crossings in the world. The strait funnels the northeast monsoon in winter and the southwest monsoon in summer, creating steep, short seas, sudden violent squalls, and long stretches when a wooden junk that misses its weather window can be blown clear across the East China Sea or piled up on the reefs of the Penghu Islands in the middle. Even today, it is a difficult passage. In the age of sail, it was a killing zone. That killing zone was the personal moat of a pirate king named Cai Qian, born in 1761 in Tainan district in Fujian, who between roughly 1795 and 1809 fought the Qing Empire to a bloody standstill up and down the coasts of Fujian, Zhejiang, Guangdong, and Taiwan. Cai Qian was in a sense a professional. He is described in Chinese sources as a sea merchant who slid into piracy, and by 1799 he had married a young woman recorded as Lin Yuzhao, who was reportedly a weapons expert who also spoke English. Whether or not she really acted as an interpreter and armorer, Cai Qian's operation clearly benefited from someone who could deal with European contraband dealers. British merchants, in defiance of Qing law, sold him English firearms. When the Qianlong Emperor found out that British traders were arming a Chinese pirate king, it caused a diplomatic row that some historians still connect to the deteriorating Chinese view of the British in the years leading up to the Opium War. By 1802, Cai Qian and his ally Zhu Fen had struck the coastal artillery bases at Xiamen. In 1804, he defeated a Qing fleet out of Wenzhou. In open battle, in 1804 and 1805, he twice attacked Tainan, the provincial capital of Taiwan. Both attempts on the city were repulsed, but the fact that a pirate fleet was besieging a provincial capital of the Chinese Empire tells you what the Qing were up against. In 1805, he went further and openly proclaimed himself King of Zhenhai, King of the Pacified Sea. Even his son, of a sea merchant title, became too small. He wanted a throne. The Qing response was systematic and brutal. They mobilized naval forces from Zhoushan. They built new war junks. They poured money into cannon foundries. The historian Antony described how the decimation of several Fujian and Zhejiang pirate gangs, together with the collapse of the Taisan pirates in 1802, gave Cai Qian the vacuum he needed to become the dominant sea power on the southeast Chinese coast. Between 1800 and 1802, he would ruin that vacuum before Zheng Yisao filled it. The Qing sent one of their best officers, Provincial Commander Li Changzheng of Zhejiang. Cai Qian killed him. What the Qing could not do was chase him across the strait. Their war junks were built heavy for coastal defense, not for the killer weather of the Middle Taiwan Strait. When Cai Qian saw a war fleet approaching from Fujian, he crossed to Taiwan. When the Qing pursued him, they lost ships to the crossings that he knew and they did not. He timed his fleets to the monsoon windows and the current changes that his rivals refused to risk. For over a decade, the Qing Navy chased him and could not catch him. It took a joint campaign, drawing together admirals from Fujian and Zhejiang, and a running battle near Hong Kong in January 1808 that lasted a full day and night to break him. Cai Qian was cornered, at last, off Wenzhou in Zhejiang in 1809. His flagship was hit and caught fire. He detonated his own powder magazine, killing himself, and by one Chinese account, his family and 250 crewmen with him. The Qing Navy captured 28 large ships, sank over 40 pirate vessels, and drowned countless of his men. Legend says he had a great treasure hidden somewhere in the Matsu Islands and that no one has ever found it. He shot himself, some traditions insist, with a golden bullet. The Taiwan Strait had been his moat for 14 years. In the end, it took the sea itself and a burning powder magazine to finish him. That is number 2. Number 1, the Iranun of the Sulu Sea. And now we come to the fortress that is the sea itself. The Sulu Sea sits between the southern Philippines, Borneo, and the Celebes. It is a warm, shallow tropical basin studded with thousands of small islands, laced with coral reefs, and cut by narrow channels the Spanish called simply the passages. It has been raided out for at least half a millennium, and the raiders who owned it, more than any other single group, were the Iranun. The Iranun were, and are, a Muslim maritime people culturally and linguistically related to the Maranao, and Maguindanao of Mindanao. From bases along the Illana Bay coast of Mindanao, and later from Balangingi in the Sulu archipelago and beaches on the eastern side of Borneo, they built one of the largest and most sustained slave raiding operations in world history. Their annual raiding fleets targeted the Spanish Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, the Straits of Malacca, and North Borneo. Their aim was slaves, whom they sold to the Sulu Sultanate at Jolo. Their weapon was the sea. The Irana warship, the Lanong, was a purpose-built raider. It was long, low, and lightly framed up to about 30 meters in length. It carried outriggers for stability and speed under sail, and along both sides of the hull, it had banks of oars that could be worked by rowers when the wind died or when a burst of speed was needed to close a merchantman. A large Lanong could carry between 150 and 200 fighting men. Its bows and gunnels bristled with Lantaka small brass swivel guns that could throw grape shot into a European ship's deck at close range. Beside the Lanong ran smaller vessels, the Garay of the Sama Balangingi, and the swift Kakap or Salasipan canoes, which could slip under the guns of a European ship and swarm her with boarders, and they came in fleets. Ordinary raiding expeditions numbered dozens of ships. In the great raiding seasons of the early 19th century, when the Napoleonic Wars had drawn most European warships out of Southeast Asian waters, combined Iranan and Sama and Balangingi flotillas of between 60 and 100 prahus were recorded, and Bruneian accounts of the pacification of the Lanoon described deployments of up to 200 war prahs. They ranged as far north as Manila Bay itself, in the shadow of the Spanish colonial capital, carrying off hundreds and sometimes thousands of captives every year. Spanish authorities estimated that Iranan and related raiders transported several 100,000 captives to Sulu markets over the course of their peak activity. Spain had been the colonial ruler of the northern Philippines since the 16th century. Spain had a proper navy. Spain had fortifications along its coasts, watchtowers, mounted guns, and armed galleons. It could do almost nothing about the Iranan for close to 300 years. The reason was the sea. Spanish warships were heavy sailing vessels built for the Atlantic and the Great Blue Water crossings. They drew too much water to slip into the coral mazes of the Sulu archipelago. They could not row upwind in a calm the way a rowed Lanong could, and they had no idea where the safe channels between the reefs actually ran. Spanish captains would sail into apparently open water and find themselves aground on coral shelves that gutted the hull. Iranan captains would watch this happen from the other side of the reef and laugh. The Iranan and Balangingi built their bases on islands like Balangingi in the Sulu Sea, protected by reef mazes that only they knew, in villages where large vessels could be hidden in coves, screened by mangrove, and where smaller Salasipan could dart out disguised as fishing boats to snap up unwary crews close to shore. The Spanish did not have the tool to break in. Not until the middle of the 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution finally handed Spain shallow draft steam gunboats that did not need wind, could burn coal to drive them into shallow water, and were armored against boarders, did the empire finally get vessels that could chase Iranun and Balangingi raiders into their own home reefs. In 1848, Spanish forces used those new steam gunboats to storm Balangingi itself, destroying the settlement and killing hundreds. Even then, the raids did not fully stop Panglima Julano Taupan, a Sama chief who had escaped the Spanish destruction of Balangingi, tried to convince the Sultan of Sulu to strike back at Spain to liberate the captives. The Sultan, under Spanish pressure, refused, but in 1852, Taupan simply started his own new war anyway. His ban triggered what one historian, James Warren, called a general sea war that lasted 6 years and cost Spain enormous sums, and at times joined forces with Iranan and Sama raiders elsewhere in the archipelago, mustering flotillas of 60 to 100 prahus. The British Royal Navy joined the fight in some periods only to pull back under criticism in London for the brutality of their operations, which often ended in the killing of hundreds of alleged pirates in a single engagement. It took Spain 3 centuries and the invention of the steam engine to finally follow the Iranun into their own waters. And even then, the raids did not stop entirely. They only faded when the whole political and economic system that supported them, the Sulu Sultanate, The Southeast Asian slave market, the Great Iranun, and Balangingi bases was smashed. No pirate on this list held out longer against a colonial empire. No fleet on this list was larger. No sea on this list was deadlier for the Navy trying to follow. That is why the Iranun of the Sulu Sea, take number 1, that is the list, 10 pirates, whose true fortress was never a fort at all, but the water itself. From the reed marshes of the Dnieper, to the coral shelves of the Sulu Sea, from the mud channels of the Sundarbans, to the killing crossings of the Taiwan Strait from the lee shore rocks. Of Cornwall to the wind-scoured cliffs of Cape Matapan. They did not win because they had bigger ships, or more men, or better cannons. They won because they knew the sea and the great empires of the world did not. Which one of these pirates should have been higher on the list? Was the Sulu Sea really deadlier than the Taiwan Strait? Did the Ushkuiniki deserve a higher spot for taking down Sarai Batu with riverboats? Drop your ranking in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. This channel spans the whole world, and every comment tells YouTube to keep sending these stories out further. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the corners of pirate history, the textbook skips smash that like button. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. We have more forgotten raiders, more impossible captains, and more coasts where empires died coming your way. Thank you for watching. Some of these men and women deserve to be remembered, and some of them just deserve to be understood. Either way, they earned their place on the water. We will see you in the next one.